In this week's video, I'll be throwing, turning, glazing, and firing a tall, cylindrical lidded jar, a process that in reality takes a few weeks or months even from start to finish. Pottery certainly isn't a fast craft. Creating ceramics is filled with long periods of waiting for freshly thrown pots to dry or for kilns firing up and slowly cooling down. It always begins roughly at the same point though. This clay is called Earthstone ES80 and it's manufactured to be reduction fired, or at least that's when you'll get the best results out of it. If you fire this body in an electric kiln and in a normal oxidized atmosphere, it just turns a flat grey sort of tone, whereas if you reduction fire it in a gas kiln, it's far more rich and flecked with specks of iron, and it can flash nicely from where the flames come into contact with it. I used about 2.7 kilos of clay, which is about 6 pounds. Before this clay can be thrown with though, it needs to be wedged up. This is a process of folding it and rotating it over and over again so that a spiral is created beneath my hands which gets ever smaller and smaller, and as the pockets of air are drawn into that spiral, they're eventually stretched and popped, hopefully leaving us with a wedge lump that's completely even in texture and has no tiny pockets of air anywhere in it. This mass is then slapped down onto the wheel as centrally as possible, hence why I'm patting it, which also helps even out the shape, which, for centering larger pieces of clay, like this, helps tremendously, as compared to starting off with a shape that's uneven and spins around quite irregularly, which means that you can actually do quite a lot of the work before you even begin throwing with water. I then begin by coning the clay up. I then push it back down and run my hands over the outside of the lump, squeezing my hands and fingertips very firmly and allowing what's pushed in to push up, out, through the top. Just like coning, I'll repeat this process numerous times until the lump of clay beneath my hands is spinning as true as can be, as that's where you want your clay to be before you begin the next steps of throwing a pot. If you are throwing and the lump you're working on is uncentered, wobbling around and spinning inconsistently, if you try and throw that lump into an actual pot, those inconsistencies will only get worse and worse as the walls are pulled up and the form is shaped. So it's worth taking your time, especially with larger lumps of clay. Once I can begin to feel like the lump of clay is spinning smoothly, I'll begin guiding it into the shape I want in order that it can be opened up and the base formed inside the pot. I then use both my thumbs and push right down into the middle. My aim here is to create a well where the base of the pot is about 1 centimetre or 1.5 centimetres thick, and the rest of the clay is distributed in a ring around it. You don't want to poke your fingers all the way to the metal of the wheel head, and these days I just judge the thickness by comparing the height of the floor inside the pot with the height of the metal wheel outside of the pot, which I can do by eye. If you're less sure, you can take a potter's needle and stick it through the base all the way to the metal. You then slide a finger down the potter's needle inside the pot until it touches the base of the vessel. Then you can pull the needle out, and what's left on the end is the thickness of the base of your pot. Next, I collar in the wall so that it's pointing upwards. Previously it was splaying out somewhat, and it being in that position would have made the first pull a bit less manageable to control. I then pinch with my thumb and fingers of my right hand and just focus on thinning out the thick mass of clay slightly. Throughout this process, I'm going to try and keep the walls of the pot so that they taper inwards. I do this because with each pull, and as the pot gets taller, the walls will naturally want to splay outwards. And so, by tapering them in after each pull, I keep the vessel more contained and should, hopefully, have more control over it too. I then switch to using a soaked sponge with my outside hand, which I find helpful for throwing larger pieces of clay like this. It gradually releases water as I pull, and it makes these long, slow movements just a bit easier, as my hand on the outside is less likely to dry out. Throughout this throwing process, you want to keep both the pot and your hands very hydrated, and if either component dries out too much, say your hands or the pot, then one part will simply stick to the other, distorting or ruining the pot you've been throwing. You want the clay to flow through your hands, rather than the clay sticking to them. Now the real pulls can begin. A bulge is formed from inside the pot by my fingers pushing outward. On the outside, I'm pushing the sponge beneath this bulge, whilst also pushing it a bit too, and together they move up, very gradually and very slowly. And I really can't overestimate how important that is. If you try and rush this process or move your hands around sporadically, then in most cases those irregularities are just imparted into the walls of the pot, and slowly it'll begin to wobble, maybe a twist will form or a thin spot, and thereafter the vessel will just become more and more difficult to make. I'm also not squeezing really hard the entire time. This initial pinch might be quite firm, but I don't keep pinching and pinching ever smaller and smaller as I travel up, as that just causes the walls to taper in thickness. So really, the pinch I begin with, I hold all the way up so that the gap between my fingers on the inside and the outside of the pot remains the same the entire time. Then, finally, as my hands get close to the rim, I release tension either side of the top instead of throwing through the rim, which can pinch and distort it and create an unwanted undulation. I then reach my hands back down to the bottom and I begin again. But I do make sure in between each pull that I sufficiently hydrate the walls on the outside and on the inside, just to keep my hands flowing smoothly. And it does take time. This single pull took about 45 seconds from start to finish. And it's one of the reasons why I really enjoy throwing bigger pieces, as it is a much slower and more considered process, as compared to say little mugs or bowls, which I throw with such speed. And although making both roughly entails the same process, they are very different nonetheless. When making these jars, I do purposefully leave the rim to be quite thick, as after the cylinder has been thrown and shaped, I'll then indent the top to form the gallery into which the lid will fit into. If instead I were to throw the rim to be really wafer thin at this point, then there simply wouldn't be enough clay to work with later on, and I'd have no chance of throwing a nice gallery. I keep the wheel spinning at about a medium speed for this process, and in the same way I don't move my hands around erratically as I pull the walls up. I also keep the wheel spinning at a nice even rate for the exact same reason. If I suddenly speed up or slow down, the rate at which the clay moves through my hands will change, so it's best just to keep it spinning smoothly. I don't slow down the wheel when I release my hands. Instead, I just very carefully detach the sponge and my fingertips, and if I do need to stop the wheel, I make sure I'm not touching the pot as the wheel slowly comes to a stop. In fact, I very rarely ever touch the pot when it's speeding up or slowing down, and I only ever really make contact when it's already spinning. Think of when you turn wood on a lathe. You never position your gouge on the piece of wood and then go to press the on button, and the very same is true when throwing pots on the wheel. I think this is high enough for my liking. Next, I'm just going to collar in the slight bulge in the waist of this pot, just to keep the walls nice and straight. And although I need to form the gallery on the top of this pot, I'll clean off the outside and the bottom of this vessel before I get around to doing that. So, first things first, I need to make sure I remove all of the excess water trapped inside the vessel. And with a pot this size, and with this wide opening, I can do this just with my arm and a car sponge. Next, I'll scrape away the slight curve of clay that surrounds the bottom, extending the cylinder all the way into the metal of the wheelhead. I get asked so many questions about this tool in particular, and I always respond with what's probably a very boring answer, as it's just an ancient old turning tool, which I've used so much that the metal is completely blunt, and I think I've snapped and glued the handle back twice now. After this, I'll begin to remove all of the excess slip from the outside form of the jar. For this process, I prefer to use metal kidneys, as opposed to wooden or plastic ones. They bite at the clay more, or as an old tutor of mine used to say, they give the pot the kiss of steel. Typically when I'm doing this, I'm pushing with my fingertips on my left hand out through the wall of the pot against the metal edge. At least, that's what I do with much smaller, thinly walled pots. Whereas with larger, thicker pieces like this, I can get away with digging the metal in just a bit. Removing the slip not only neatens up the outside shape, but by removing this layer of very watery clay and revealing firmer, tackier stuff beneath, it'll help the pot dry out leather hard more quickly once removed from the wheel. With that done, it's now time to set the gallery. So I sponge some water over the top, brace the inside walls with the fingers of my left hand, and with my wetted index finger, I push the tip of it into the wall to create an indentation. If you try and do this with dry hands and a dry rim, it just won't work. You need to make sure that your fingertip, your hands, and the rim of the pot are really hydrated. They need to be able to flow smoothly. Otherwise, one part will stick to the other, and the whole top of the pot could be drawn out of shape. I then refine the walls beneath, which naturally deform just a bit as the top's pushed in. I want the outer edge to be a sharp right angle, and even though I'll trim this again once leather hard, I still define these sections as best I can at this stage. I'll then use a pair of calipers to measure the width of the opening. This way I can throw a lid that fits tightly. I then slide a wire beneath the vessel to separate it from the metal wheelhead, and then with dry hands I carefully clasp around the bottom of the pot and lift it away, spinning the wheel at the exact moment I lift, which breaks any sticky seal there could be. Next, it's the lid's turn. I start by reversing my calipers, and in doing this, I always give myself an extra millimetre or two, as it's so worth just having that bit of extra material to work with. As clay dries to leather hard, it can warp and move, and in some cases, if thrown extraordinarily accurately, you can end up with lids that don't quite fit right if the two parts haven't been dried out evenly enough. So by giving myself just a bit of extra material, it means I can always trim it down to be exactly right, which means I won't have lids that rattle in place once fired. Instead they fit snugly, which is always a sign of good craftsmanship in my eye. The lids are much quicker objects to make, and I use really soft clay, which makes centering and squashing the lump down far easier. As they have practically no vertical height, the integrity of the clay doesn't matter so much. What I mean by that is I wouldn't use this same soft clay to throw the jar component. I make a small opening in the middle of the disc and then gradually drag it out. My aim here is to create a pot that has a thick outer section that I'll then be able to split into two parts. The first is the vertical locating flange, and it's this part that's going to sit inside the internal diameter of the jar, whereas the lower horizontal plane will hold the lid up on the rim as it protrudes slightly over it. I then make sure the side of the lid is straight, and then I'll take my measure calipers and I'll check the diameter, which was pretty spot on at this point. I just needed to make it slightly wider, which I do by pushing inside out with my fingertips. And as I left myself excess material when throwing this, it doesn't matter if it's not completely accurate at this stage, and I can spend all of 2 seconds trimming it when leather hard to make it fit. I then remove the water and compress the clay a bit inside the well, as if I don't do this, occasionally a crack will form inside, spanning the base, and then once again I scrape over all of the surfaces with the sharp metal kidney to remove as much slip as I possibly can. Most importantly though, is removing the slip from this lower section, as it's from this part of the pot that I'll lift the lid away. If it was covered in slip, the lid would stick horribly to my hands, and it would be hard putting it down without the whole thing deforming. I then drag my twisted metal wire underneath and then scrape the worst of the slip off my hands and fingertips. I then position them around so there's a lot of contact, spin the wheel and lift away. And that's the thrown components finished. I'll now leave these for a couple of days, rotating the pieces so they dry out evenly, and once they're completely leather hard, the pieces can be trimmed and put together. Once leather hard, the components can be handled without worry of damaging them. Much of the moisture the clay contained is now evaporated, and as that happens, the clay shrinks. This means that ideally, you want both of the pieces you're turning to fit together to be the same consistency in terms of how dry they are. If there's a mismatch, and you turn them to fit when they're actually quite different in consistency, then as the pieces dry out further, they might begin to not fit. I begin by centering the lid and attaching it in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, and then I can begin to tidy the lid up. But perhaps more importantly, I can begin to turn the vertical flange to get it to the point that it fits inside the jar perfectly. And the way I do this is to remove layer by layer very carefully, and then I offer the jar up to see if it fits, which in this case it didn't quite, and you can actually see the mark left where it came into contact with the flange. And it's for this reason too, when I'm actually throwing the flange, that I don't make it too thin and scrawny. I need to have excess material in this part so I can trim it to fit, and once it fits, I can continue trimming the lid to the finesse of my liking. If I'm able to, I always try to keep one finger opposite the area I'm turning, that way I can feel the cross-section of the part I'm working on, gauging the thickness, and even supporting it a little bit, as even though the clay is quite dry at this stage, it can still be moved and distorted very easily with just a small amount of pressure. And now the jar fits, so from this point onwards, I'll begin trimming the interior part of the lid, thinning out the vertical flange, and then trimming away some of the excess weight from the lower section of the well, which will ultimately become the top of the lid. Although I do want to leave some thickness in this part, as later, when I'm trimming the top side of this lid, I'll turn a concave hollow into it, so I do need to be considerate of that. Now that the underside of the lid is finished, I'll take this off and I'll brush some slip onto the metal wheel head. This is just very watered down clay. I'll then take the body of the jar and I'll position it onto this. Then I'll firmly tap center the jar so that it's spinning true. The slip will quickly dry, holding the pot firmly in place. I then also use a rubber kidney just to squash a tiny portion of the outer wall into the metal. With the pot securely held in place, I can begin to trim. For this first pass, I'm using the sharp corner of my hook bison turning tool, which I hold very securely with my right hand, which at the same time is bracing against my left hand. They work together to add stability, and in some cases I even clasp my right hand with my left hand to keep the blade as steady as possible as it moves through clay that might undulate a little bit beneath it. I want the blade to stay true and to cut a very straight line, slicing through any slight wobbles or inconsistencies in the walls of the pot as I go, rather than letting those inconsistencies influence my movements. I then do a second pass, this time with the flat edge of the blade, removing all those grooves and just neatening up the form. Even with my left hand now inside the pot, I still brace my trimming arm by tucking my elbow into my torso and leaning my upper body weight onto that arm. In fact, I'm always bracing this arm in some way, shape or form during this process. In a similar way to when I'm pulling the walls up, I trim in a very even and gradual manner, and my aim at this point is to thin the walls out and to refine the shape of the pot. And thankfully, all of these trimmings can be easily recycled, and I'll leave a link on screen now and in the description below that shows just how I'd go about that process. For the most part, I use tungsten carbide turning tools, which are extremely sharp, but they're also very fragile, and if I drop one of these blades onto the concrete floor, they'll either chip or shatter completely. Once the walls have been trimmed, I quickly skim over them with a flat metal kidney. This removes the more prominent turning marks and just makes for a slightly straighter surface, whilst also burnishing the clay just a little bit. For some glaze types, a burnished surface can make a big impact on how the glaze looks at the end, but for the glazes I use, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. So for any region of the pot that I know is going to be covered in glaze, I don't need to finish it quite to the same degree as I would, say, the base of the pot, or anywhere where the clay is left bare. Next I'll trim the lid, and I use a spinner placed on top to apply downward pressure that's distributed across the entire top of the lid. It stops my fingertips from rubbing against the coarse clay. You may not quite be able to see it, but the white portion of the tool spins and the black part stays stationary, as there's a ball bearing between them. And at this point, I just trim the sides of the lid until it's flush with the body beneath. For more detailed work like this, I hold the trimming tool very close to the tip. In fact, that's more or less how I always hold it, with my fingertips pinching near the blade and the end wooden part of the tool pressing into my palm. As these tools are so sharp and the clay is still relatively really soft, all it takes is one error, one bad movement, or for the blade of the tool to suddenly catch, leaving an irreparable mark. The next part to turn is the top of the lid, and for this part I want to trim a slightly concave surface, so I switch to a tool that has a curved edge so I can carve in a slight hollow. The idea here is to create a region in which the glaze can pool thickly into, as where the glaze is thick it tends to look a bit more interesting, and I think it just adds something beyond just being a flat top, as I can no longer use my spinner tool to keep the lid pinned down. The fingers of my left hand are now more or less doing the same job, but thankfully as the lid fits so tightly into the jar, it's held in place almost like a chuck, which makes the whole process of trimming these types of pots a bit more straightforward. As well as using a curved blade, I also use the curved side of a metal kidney just to scrape over this area, in the same way I did the walls below. Once the lid has been trimmed, I then remove it and turn the gallery underneath. And this is something I always do secondary to turning the lid, as once or twice when I've turned the gallery first and then trimmed the lid, the pressure of pushing the lid down into place has caused the gallery itself to crack, rendering the whole pot useless and destined for the reclaim bucket. I then usually flip the lid quickly upside down and just neaten up this outer edge, which usually just gets a bit scratched and marked throughout this process. Now there's only one part left to turn, and that's the very bottom of the pot. So I slide a sharp metal knife beneath it to separate it from the wheel and clean off the wheel head, just so no bits of clay or burrs stick into the underside of the lid. I place it back onto the wheel and center it, and then position the body of the pot on top of it. And now I'm using the lid as a chuck for the body. but I do secure the lid in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, as there is always the tendency that it could shift and move, even with all this weight pushing down on top of it. And once again I'm applying downward pressure through the spinner just to keep it held down in place. The first thing I do is trim a beveled edge around the outside of the base. This removes some of the excess weight that's trapped in that corner, and it also makes a point of contact that's less likely to chip with use. The spinner tool is then removed and I start to trim the base, and you'll see that my left finger stays stationary, pushing down as my right hand moves the blade of the tool. Yet my 2 hands are still connected via the thumbs whenever I work at this height, and I'm also pinching my elbows quite firmly into my torso, as it can be quite difficult to stabilise your hands at this height. On this area of the pot, I'm trimming away the wiring off marks, as well as thinning the base out just a touch, to hopefully be in line with the thickness of the walls. But you don't want it to be too thin. If you feel like the base of your pot is bowing inwards, even with just a tiny amount of pressure, then there's a good chance it's a bit too thin. I'll then use a smoother metal kidney to really burnish the bottom nicely. I want to compress the particulates of sand back into the body and make this area as smooth as possible before finally stamping in my maker's mark, which I made a whole video about recently, showing how I carve them, which, once again, I'll leave a link to it on screen now and in the description below. The jar is then removed and very gently placed down onto a clean surface, so no bits of clay embed themselves into the very carefully finished base. The next part of the process is to leave this vessel to slowly dry out over a couple of days, and once it's completely bone dry, which means that all the moisture has left it, it can be packed into the electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. This next step is necessary in order for the pot to be glazed, as once these pots turn bone dry, they are exceedingly fragile objects, and if they do get wet, they'll simply dissolve into a slurry, and bisque firing the pots changes that. This is my electric kiln, which has a capacity of about 7 cubic feet, or about 200 litres. It's heated up by the elements you can see winding in coils embedded into the walls, and onto these shelves I load in as many pots as I physically can, and for the first firing the pots can touch each other as the clay isn't taken up to a high enough temperature for it to flux and stick together. This means I can stack the pots very densely, which helps make these firings very cost efficient. This process of bisque firing drives off water at a molecular level, together with a few other organic materials, which all exit the kiln during the firing through a small exhaust vent near the top of the kiln. They aren't the best fumes to breathe in, but thankfully these kilns can be set to fire automatically overnight, and I just prop a window open in the studio for all the gas to escape through. During the bisque firing, the pots will shrink again slightly. The material will also become much harder, and it takes on an almost sponge-like texture, not in the way of it being soft and malleable. Rather, the clay, once bisque fired, can absorb a lot of water. Once full, the kiln is closed up and fired overnight, and then, about 36 hours later, it can be unpacked. Next comes the glazing, and it's worth noting that prior to this, I applied a thin coat of wax around the base of the pot, the gallery, and on the underside of the lid. This acts like a basic wax resist, and it means when I dunk the pots into the glaze, it doesn't coat those areas. Most importantly is the base of the pot, which, if I fired in the gas kiln with glaze covering the bottom of it, it would stick and fuse to the expensive kiln shelves. This is a feldspathic crackle glaze, which contains lots of feldspar, nepheline cyanide, talc, some whiting, some fritz, and red iron oxide, and it's this which gives the glaze its red colour at this stage, but it's also this that will make the glaze turn green once reduction fired in the gas kiln. And the way this glazing process works is that the glaze is essentially just water that carries all of these different raw materials, and due to the sponge-like nature of the clay, when the components are dipped into it, the water is drawn into the stoneware, leaving a layer of glaze on the outside, and it's this layer of glaze on the outside that melts. So with big pots like this, I begin by coating the outside, and then the following day, once all that water that's been absorbed into the walls is evaporated, I'll coat the inside in glaze, which I do by carefully pouring the glaze inside the jar. I move the jug up and down like that to get the excess drips away from the outside of the jug, as they could drip onto the outside of my already glazed jar. If I attempted to do this immediately after glazing the outside, the walls of the pot that are already saturated with water wouldn't be able to absorb any more water, and thus the raw materials wouldn't be able to really adhere to the inside form. This would mean that the glaze ends up staying wet for far too long without drying, and eventually it would just crack and fall off. And this is why the day's wait in between is so important. I then carefully pour all the glaze out, and because the rim of the pot is waxed, it does so quite nicely without dribbling over onto the outside form. Later, once the glaze has dried out a bit again, I'll clean the excess glaze off the base. If any small droplets have stuck there, which they normally do, I'll then use a soaked sponge to carefully fettle clean the rim, with my aim being to make the line where glaze meets the clay body to be as straight and neat as it can possibly be. And here's an example of how quickly the light can change in my studio with a passing cloud, which can make filming a nightmare at times. I need the clay on the top of these pots to remain bare, as I'll be firing the body and the lid together. Not only does this save space in the kiln, but it also ensures that the two pieces fit really well. And if there's any atmospheric differences during the firing, it ensures that the two components match in terms of colour and texture. To apply the waddings onto the lid, I carefully place it down onto a piece of foam, and then I press my waddings into small discs. The recipe I use for my wadding is 50% china clay and 50% coarse alumina hydrate. I mix it with water until it's a clay-like consistency, and then I can use it like this to hoist the lid above the body so that neither part is actually touching during the firing, otherwise they'd fuse together. Wadding is a highly refractory material, which means it doesn't melt whatsoever, at the temperatures I'm firing to at least. I then place the lid on top, making sure that the waddings are only ever touching areas of the lid and the jar that have no glaze on them, as if they do touch glaze, they'll stick to it. The jar is then positioned in the gas kiln along with about 150 other pots, and during this firing, none of them can touch, which makes packing this kiln a bit more of a challenge. Early the following morning, the kiln is then lit. This is fueled with natural gas from a main supply, and each firing takes about 9 hours from beginning to end. Unlike my electric kiln, which can be fired automatically, this one is entirely manual, and I'll do my best to explain it in quite a succinct manner. I light each of the 4 burners that fire into the bottom of the kiln. I begin the firing by going quite slowly, gradually easing up the temperature to get rid of any moisture that could be left in the glaze, as if a pot is still quite soaked with water and I increase the temperature too dramatically, the pots can quite literally explode. Every 30 minutes I check the temperature and I increase it just a touch, and at a certain point I turn on an air compressor which helps pressurize the flames. Then, at 860 degrees exactly, I initiate reduction, which I do by increasing both the gas and air pressure quite considerably, and at the same time I slide a damper over the flues of the kiln, which means the exhaust can't escape quite so quickly. This causes the fuel inside the chamber to burn inefficiently, as there's simply not enough oxygen, and the byproduct of this is that the burning fuel seeks oxygen from inside the clay and the glazes, thus changing their colours into something that's very difficult to replicate in an electric kiln. Once the kiln reaches approximately 1290 degrees Celsius, it's switched off and allowed to cool very slowly for about 2 days. And these things you see here are the pyrometric cones, which are packed alongside all the pots inside, and I can actually look at them through the spy holes in the door. As they heat up, they bend over very gradually, and once they're all flat, I know it's time to end the firing. This is now a few days later, and the kiln has cooled down enough for it to finally be opened. And this moment of cracking it open is always quite an anxiety-inducing moment, as whilst I have a good idea of what to expect, there's always a few things that surprise me, and without question, it's when pots are fired that the most things can go wrong, and it's all fairly out of your control. The door is then swung open, which lets the last of that hot air out, and finally, after weeks and maybe months of work, the pots can be unpacked. The difference in colour really is stark, and those powdery soft surfaces have now turned into a glassy layer. Heat rises, so the pots at the top are always the warmest, hence the gloves. All the pots are then unpacked and laid out on the table to be inspected and have their bases sanded, but any form with a lid needs to have the lid removed, and in some cases they can get a bit stuck, and typically this is how I remove them. It takes some time, and I'm only really tapping gently, but eventually you'll hear it give, and the lid can be removed. Some lids can be removed very easily, and in fact it's quite rare that they get stuck to such a degree. I'll have to grind this lid with some carborundum grinding paste, which will make all the difference and make it fit with a glassy smooth finish. Like so. And here it is, the finished piece, now a pale blue tone, and it shrunk again during this final firing. This clay shrinks about 12% from freshly thrown to finally fired. Thanks so much for watching, as always, especially to those of you who make it through to the end, and I always appreciate hearing if you did. And I'll see you next week.